My first piece of advice is like, yes, do it. Like, don't hold back. Like, if you are a performer and you're like, wow, I just heard this amazing piece of music by someone who's still alive, and I just think that, I would love to be in musical conversation with that person or like with my friend. Do it.
I remember discovering today's guests for the first time. I was going through my Instagram feed and I thought, what is this? Soprano and bass? That's interesting. We chatted about doing an interview. It finally happened. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with departure duo Nina Guo, soprano, and Edward Kass, Eddie Kass, on bass. And they've dedicated themselves to performing, commissioning, and researching music for soprano and double bass. How cool is that? We talk all about what they're up to, their backstory, their 30 by 30 project, which is 30 hours of soprano and bass music by the year 2030. I love that. How they became enthralled by this soprano bass combination, the extensive research that they've done for soprano and bass music, and much more. I know you're going to love this episode, and a big shout out to our sponsors, D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, Modacity, Colstein Music, the A440 Violin Shop, and Upton Bass String Instrument Company. Thank you to all those folks, and we will open and close with a little bit of music from Departure Duo. Much more on their website and their Instagram feed and their YouTube channel. Let's dig in. Maybe we could start by just telling folks about the history of the duo. I think you started about 5 years ago, right? Just tell me a little bit about how you met and how that got started. Then maybe we can talk a bit about your individual backgrounds.
Yeah.
So both of us went to New England Conservatory for school, and we met NEC is a small enough place that, spend 2 years there and you start to see the same faces over and over again. And, even if you don't necessarily play in the same groups, like you see Eddie with a bass and you're like, oh, that's a double bassist, you can kind of figure out what people do.
You start to learn about like the different kinds of projects people are interested in. And so both of us were doing a good deal of new music, and Nina was putting together a group to play the Crumb Madrigals, which are awesome pieces and use bass and soprano.
And so that was our first project that we did together, where we kind of played together. And we really, really enjoyed doing that, putting the madrigals together as a piece. And I think, Eddie, you were preparing for a recital.
Yeah, I was going to be doing, because that was in the spring, and then I was going to be doing a recital the next fall. And we liked the whole group, but particularly the two of us enjoyed working together. And there was a set of Kurtog pieces for soprano and bass, which Kurtog is one of my favorite composers, and I'd played a bunch of his other bass chamber music. But I was sort of looking for someone who'd be able to sing that with me. And so I asked Nina, and we started working on that.
And we were both fortunate that at the time, both of our teachers were super, super encouraging and helpful in the process. So when I kind of, brought this piece of double bass to my lessons, my teacher was like, oh, great. And this is super cool. This is how you can make it better. This is how you can make it musical. And it was kind of a similar dialogue with Eddie's teacher as well. And so right from the start, we had a lot of encouragement and a lot of a lot of support from our teachers and from people saying this is really cool, and it should be done really, really well. And so we did this first piece together. It went really well, and we were like, wow, let's see if there's more out there for soprano and double bass.
Yeah, and that's when we started digging through library stacks, talking to other people, trying to find more pieces. And then the first sort of year that we were playing together was sort of more getting to know each other and getting to learn how we work together. And then eventually we found enough rep, and including our first commission, to make a whole program. And so then our first entire program of just the two of us was spring 2016. And then from there, things have gone on.
Yeah. And so, like a lot of new music groups, we follow the model that, of course, we need repertoire to play. So we do commission people to write new pieces. But also we kind of got a little bit, we don't believe in the idea, oh, what we do is so niche and, we have to play everything that we know in one concert. In our eagerness to move out of that model, we kind of moved into research as well, which is why we in part created the database. I mean, partially we don't want to claim that we're playing everything that's ever been written for soprano double bass because that's simply not true.
Because we also don't want to.
And we also don't want to. Because, it's vocal music. Some of the music that is written for soprano is written for a different kind of soprano, or it's music that would not necessarily work to be played in one of our concerts because what we do is a recital. It's a playthrough, so yeah, I mean, it's really, really nice because basically our goal, in addition to commissioning people that we like and working with people that we like, is to be able to program whatever we want, whatever kind of music we want.
Yeah, not just be like, well, we have to program these pieces because it's the only ones we have.
That's a danger. That's a danger you can fall into. My wife is a harpist, and so there is some harp and bass. So immediately as I started to sort of follow along with you both on Instagram a while ago, I thought, it's like, oh yeah, there's some stuff. But is there much? And the answer is there's more than you might think, but not a lot. And I love what you've done. I love what you're doing, just in general. I think it's very cool. And then that database that you started, it's really in the spirit of projects I love. And you got tons of great details. I'll make sure to link to that, but down to like the amount of time, the total amount of time, bass notes that Eddie has for specific performing ideas, who it was commissioned by. So just thank you for doing that. Yeah. That's so cool.
And one of the really, really interesting things going through and like compiling this database it's pretty comprehensive. Right now there's about 15 hours of music, but we all are still digging up things. But one of the really interesting things, like you mentioned, that we do include who commissioned these pieces, is you can see these little pockets in time when there were other groups playing soprano bass stuff. Like there's a bunch of stuff from like the 70s and 80s.
Yeah,
that was like
Jane Manning and Barry Guy when they
Jane Manning and Barry Guy, and then Mimi Fulmer and Bert Turetsky were commissioning things. And it's really it's interesting though to look at those projects and see that for the most part, the pieces those two groups were playing was almost exclusively pieces written for them. So no one knew that there were other soprano double bass pieces when there were soprano double bass pieces being written. And so I think this project that we're doing and like creating this database, which will hopefully inspire other people to play this kind of music because it's great. There's so much variety and it's like such a rich repertoire, but it's like finally bringing these together and showing like the relationships between these pieces that might've been written at the same time for very different people, or pieces that were written in similar times, like half a world away, and the different ways people have tackled the soprano bass combination. Cause you get such a huge variety in ones like the sort of, we refer to it as our Freebird, the Beat for Latopagos, which is like the most well-known of the soprano bass things for the most part. Like he's writing in this sound world where the bass is playing like these extremely high harmonics and the soprano is like singing in that same range. And you get this weird blended sound where you can't tell what is coming from who. And then you get other pieces where it's like the bass is pretty much staying very low in the register and almost like accompanying the soprano. And like, it's just, there's so many possibilities with what the combination can do.
That's something that I noticed listening through to some of your videos on YouTube and various other clips, because sometimes when Eddie goes up into the harmonic zone, I thought like, wow, that is the register. And that's one of the things a friend of mine, Sam Suggs, wonderful bassist and composer, he talks about that being one of the uniquely appealing things to him for writing for bass. He says, even if he didn't play bass, he'd want to write for it because you have those different sonorities accessible to you.
And it's great because I think the soprano bass combination, like bass is not such a historically great instrument to put as a soloist in front of a whole orchestra because that makes balance is such a problem. It's not a very loud instrument, as we've all struggled with. But with soprano and bass, you can really take advantage of the entire range of sounds and colors possible, and you can still hear them clearly. And then it's not like with solo bass, it's great, but once you have the voice in there, like you can also show what potential there is in those colors to meld with something else and like create this really
it's a really unique sound. But it's also, I think, what's been interesting to me about kind of getting to know the music that we play and seeing composers' different approaches is that I mean, because we basically play as two soloists in a way in our duo. Like we're both two soloists, but it's so easy for us to become one instrument in the sounds that we make. And so even though you have, when you say soprano and double bass, of course you think, wow, total opposites, could not be further apart. It's like, well, actually, that's not true.
The drama, the sort of the theatricality, boy, I can't speak to of some of these pieces in your performance. It's on your website, front and center now, so people probably check it out. But Der Amerikaner, I think, which made me think, oh, my internet went out multiple times when I started it, and I'll just leave that as a hook, so people have to go check it out. But and even exploring. What was that other piece? It's more recent, Confronting Distance or something. I really enjoy how some of your repertoire really explores silence and space and drama, and then it comes back and Eddie striking the bass, and it's really interesting. Yeah.
One of the fun things for me playing all this repertoire is because I think for vocalists, like that's something they always have to think about. When you're singing, like if you're doing a song recital, if you're in opera, even when you're singing in like choirs, they have to think about who is the voice, like who is speaking, who are you speaking to, what am I doing physically to convey these emotions or this intention. And like, that's something you guys think about all the time, like as vocalists, but I think it's so important for instrumentalists to start thinking about those things. And like the way we play together, it gives me a chance to embrace that theatricality without necessarily imposing stuff on top of the music that's not there, but learning ways to bring that out with like what I am doing physically, like how I prepare for an entrance, how I might like end something, what sort of posture I have and the way that I like respond to sounds. And it's something that I think can really enhance the way, at least for me, it's really enhanced the way I think about phrasing and think about music, to like always be conscious of like, okay, what is the intent of this phrase? Like who is speaking here? Who am I saying this to? What is happening? Even if it's not like a narrative piece, but to like have that mindset has been like, I've learned a lot that I bring to music that I don't play with Nina.
What is an American style of bass? Here's Gary and Eric from Upton Bass on the topic.
So there's a joke about American instruments, all right? If I can take 4 violins and go to let's say a top-notch violin appraiser, and he can take the first one out and look at it and go, well, this one's clearly Italian because of all these features. Next one, oh, this is French because of all these features. Next one, no, this is English because of these features. 4th violin, they can't tell what it is, and then they go, it's American. It's got a little bit of everything.
Learn more about their Bostonian American style model and so many other things that they have to offer you at uptonbass.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Buying a double bass is a challenge for sure, and it's not getting any easier. That's why it's so great that Colstein's is offering interest-free financing on select instruments, bows, and instrument repair purchases. Learn more at colstein.com, and while you're there, check out their wonderful selection of pedigree instruments and bows and everything else that they have to offer. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. Steve has been active in the bass world and also the guitar world for years. Here's a bit from our live podcast taping with Steve on how he got into that business.
Guitars and basses.
Guitars and basses.
Okay, how did that happen?
They're both helper instruments. I've always played the rhythm guitar, quite often with bass lines moving, either in swing style, jazz style, or country style. Bass is the same thing, supporting the band, the group of people you're playing with. So I've always felt like I was a support person.
I love how Steve describes being a support person, and he is certainly that for the bass community here on the West Coast, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. His shop is located just south of San Francisco, and he has a large retail showroom with about 70 basses on display. And these basses are professional top of the line basses. These basses are student level basses and everything in between. They're beautifully set up. So if you're looking for a bass or you know someone who is, be sure to check out Steve at steveswanstringbass.com. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, Steve. Yeah, I think that's a danger that us non-vocalists fall into. And I remember chatting with the principal bass of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, Rex Serrani, recent, and one thing that struck me is just how fully he understands the drama and the what's happening in the opera at every moment. Yeah. Maybe it's one of the reasons why he got the job. But
yeah.
But I'd love to know. How did you two find yourselves drawn to this contemporary music world? We can talk together individually. Like I'm guessing if you're like most, maybe that wasn't the first thing you were doing back in California growing up. Like how did you discover this world? What was that like for you two?
So I can definitely, I was drawn to new music initially because I like weird text, to be honest. I mean, unfortunately, as much as I love Schubert's music, I am just totally not like raised in the way to be like, I just love singing about love, and I'm just so sad singing when I'm just full of sad things, and like, and then, we go to minor. I'm just not about that. It's just not the way that I think about text. And so for me, it was a pretty easy hop to get into new music. So I was like, oh, finally, I can sing a weird story that makes way more sense to me than trying to sing about a broken heart. Like the broken heart situation was just not working out, but it made way more sense to like try to get into the mind of like a strange character who is, like a strange character who's encountering a stranger, just those kinds of situations, dialogues within dialogues. Those were always the kinds of pieces and stories that I was drawn to. And mostly, text that was written in the 20th and 21st century was just clear to me. So yeah.
That and Nina really just wants to make cartoon character sounds.
It's true. I felt like my entire range of sound possibilities was not being utilized by romantic literature.
For me, it was like, still play a lot of strictly classical music. Like that is still very much a part of what I do. But I think even when I was in high school, just like we spend so much time practicing, like, making sure you're getting this like beautiful sound, making sure like, have this consistent vibrato, like all these things. But I always like enjoyed like there's sounds you can make on the bass. And I was like, if I can make these, why don't I get to make them? Like I want to use these sounds. And so there's always like that kind of like having fun going to those extremes. But I hadn't quite found an outlet for that because I didn't know about a lot of the music that was out there, like while I was in high school. But then at NEC, I was taking piano for non-majors. And my piano teacher, who was just a doctoral student at NEC, I had several years of piano with, and he was a very big influence on like my musicianship, but he was doing part of one of his doctoral recitals all on music of Kurtag. And so he was like, you're going to learn some piano music by Kurtag. And I was like, okay, fine. But seeing the way he played it and the way he talked about it and like looking at this music, I was like, oh my God, like this is brilliant. Like piano is not my main instrument. And I can't really get what I want in my head out of the piano, but why don't I look into some of the stuff he's written for bass? And sort of from there, once I started playing that, other people looking for like a bassist to do some contemporary things were like, oh, like Eddie's doing this stuff. He'll play this. And then sort of just these more things opened up. And I sort of fell into a lot of that.
I think also both of us are really, really interested in chamber music. And that, yeah. I mean, it's kind of no mystery where that comes from. NEC has a super, not to just be like, like an advertisement for NEC, but like the chamber music program is extremely, extremely strong here. I mean, there's just something in the water where if you are interested in chamber music, even as a singer, which is sort of, I'm not the super typical chamber music instrument. There's a lot of encouragement and a lot of, support to make make that happen. Even if it, even if you're like, I want to play soprano double bass music, everyone's like, great.
Because like Nina said, I love playing bass chamber music, and I will play Trout as many times as anyone asks me to, because I love that piece. But if you want to really expand and play as much bass chamber music as possible, like, you should be looking at things that are newer and more recent. And the same thing with bass as a solo instrument. Some of the best music that is originally written for bass is the newer stuff, because it really embraces all this, like you were saying that Sam talks about, it embraces this entire side of these extended techniques and these extra sounds that can be made.
Yeah, and I've spent some time with Mark Dresser down in San Diego, and talk about exploring that sound world. And you mentioned Bert Turetsky, and I mean it's really exciting what's happening in contemporary music in general, but for bass players. And you mentioned George Crumb earlier, and my mind immediately went to like looking through Black Angels or whatever. And you obviously have had a lot of experience with this in different settings, but as a duo, getting these different pieces, some of which are probably traditionally notated, sometimes less so. Maybe you got some sort of reference MIDI recording. Maybe you got nothing. You're probably performing for the first time. And I would just love to know, because I rarely get to talk about this. I'd love to know your process tackling a new piece. I mean, we could go a million different directions, but like, do you have any? Tell me about your process.
So one of our
okay. So a lot of the music that we perform, a fair amount of it is all of it's notated. We're playing off score to some extent. I mean, there
might be graphic elements. There might be like some improvised passages, but it's all,
or it might be relatively open, but it's definitely on paper. And that is what we do, is we want to play the paper, because that's how we feel that we have a good relationship with the composer. And the way that we go through this is, we go back to basics with every single piece.
One of our most tried and true methods that we do with every single piece that we play, even when we're coming back to some of these pieces that we've performed a lot, like we always, when we are coming back to pieces that are like really part of our repertoire, are always worried, like if we're not rehearsing them, we're worried we're like somehow straying from the score, so we need to like find a way to bring us back to that.
Yeah.
We do we just call it the clap and moan, which is
just like throw on the metronome
and we clap the tempo and just sort of like speak our rhythms.
So boring.
So it's that, like, conducting and tawing. We just conduct together and taw our rhythms, and then it sort of devolves into just moaning our rhythms. But we do it together, and I think that in a way, like, because we really, with pieces that, most of the pieces that we commission, we are premiering them. There are no recordings. There's nothing. And for us, like, we do kind of all of this groundwork together, so we go through almost every stage of learning and solidifying the music together. And we'll of course spend time on our parts individually because we have to, but like going through every measure, every rhythm, conducting it together gives us such a strong sense of how our parts fit together. It makes us sure that we are feeling exactly the same pulse for everything.
And it kind of helps us, like from the beginning, start breathing together, which is also something, my instrument doesn't go without air. Eddie's, you also need some air, I guess.
Yeah, otherwise I would pass out.
Yeah.
But so that's a huge thing that we do with everything. But then beyond that, both of us have played a lot of different kinds of new music beyond just the duo, so that we spend a lot of time talking about, like, when we get a new piece, like we take some time to try and sort of figure out what the sound world of that piece is, and whether it's like another thing. We'll be like, oh, this sound is like that other sound we played in this one piece. Okay, how are we going to make that work here? And sort of drawing from our experience, just like the way when you're playing like more standard rep, you're like, oh, like I'm playing this, maybe if you're playing a piece by a sort of relatively unknown classical composer, you'd be like, oh, but I've seen these gestures in Mozart. I know what to do with them. And so it's that same kind of drawing on, we also luckily have living composers. So we talk to them about their influences and what they were thinking of while they wrote the piece, so that we know, we can listen to other works by that composer to sort of understand their sound world, and listen to works that have influenced them.
Yeah. And then we also understand, we're so lucky in a way to live in the age, in the internet age, where it is really easy to access music by tons and tons of different people, even if they're relatively unknown. Every friend of ours, has pieces up on YouTube or whatever. And so we can really understand someone's sound world. And then we can also understand what we find exciting about it, what we want to bring to a performance. If we see a performance where we're like, wow, that didn't feel as exciting as I wanted it to. Okay, so we always think about the dangers of how someone's music can be boring. What can we do in order to make sure that it's not, that, we're always bringing as much energy to a piece as it needs.
Yeah. And above all, we try to stay as faithful as possible to the score. We try there are times, especially if we're commissioning a piece, we can work with the composer when they give us a draft and be like, hey, have you thought about changing this thing? Because we want the piece to be the best possible version of what's in the composer's head. And so sometimes, because we understand bass and soprano more than a composer writing for it for the first time, sometimes we'll be like, oh, we get the sense that you're trying to do something like this. Have you thought about changing it to modify it a little bit like this, which then will help the piece just become stronger and more effective? But we really, really, really do our best to try and stay as faithful to the score as possible. Rhythms, pitches, dynamics, the same thing you do with, when I'm preparing auditions, and playing excerpts, you really want to be, you need to be as faithful and in that box as you can be, so that you can then use that mold to become as expressive as possible.
It's a great way to describe that. That technique, as soon as you mention it, I have this hazy memory. I don't know if you ever posted anything on your Instagram of you doing that, but okay, I've seen that because I remember it might have been one of the first videos. I'm like, what is this? So okay.
Yeah, we have one. There's a video of us conducting through the part of the first movement of a piece that we commissioned by Emily Coe. It's called Emojicons. And each movement, instead of a title or tempo marking, is just an emoji. And the piece depicts those. But the first movement is this. It's called In Cold Sweat. And it's the emoji that's sort of has a blue top of their head. The mouth is open and there's a sweat droplet.
He's sweating because he's
and the movement is just this frantically fast tempo, all these nuts rhythms. Nina has a million notes and I'm
all over
jumping between Colegno and then pits and harmonics just all over. And so we're just there is a video of us just tying those rhythms and conducting.
I'm going to hunt for that and link to it because
it would be around March. It would be mid-March 2018.
Yeah, because that's when we premiered it, I think.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Make sure you have the right size string for your bass. String sizes are determined by playing length, the distance from nut to bridge. If your bass has non-standard after lengths before the nut or after the bridge, you may need a different size than you think. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. There are so many things to think about when you're practicing. Where do you even begin? Here is Modacity founder and CEO Mark Gelfo on what to prioritize in your practicing.
First things first, you got to measure time. Time is of the essence. You want to get the highest return on your time investment, and the way to do that is through listening to yourself and self-recording. Almost everybody who reads the blogs of Rob Knopper, Noah Kageyama, everybody knows self-recording is absolutely essential. So we put it front and center along with time.
Recording yourself, measuring the time you've spent on particular sections, and so many other things are available in Modacity. I love this app so much. You can learn more at modacity.co. And if you visit our website, we've got a special offer for lifetime access to the app. Check it out. You'll love it. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. And, you know, in my limited contemporary music scene experience, I've always loved it. I always think, I got to go to more. I remember seeing that you, I think, performed here in San Francisco at the Center for New Music, which I think is right in the middle of the Tenderloin.
It's not the best area.
Yeah, it's a vaguely terrifying area if people haven't been there. You'll be fine, you know, but you know, I played some with Present Music, this group in Milwaukee, played a little bit in Chicago, and I've done a little here there, but I think it's a really interesting scene. I definitely feel like it's not a scene I know a lot about, and I'm sure a lot of people listening don't spend the bulk of their time in that scene. Maybe they've never even seen a contemporary music concert. Like, just tell them what the scene's like, and we can go whatever direction you want in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we find really exciting about being in new music is actually how diverse all of the music is and can be. So in general, I mean, new music, it's written by composers who are living, but I think in terms of similarity of what they're writing, like similarities kind of can stop there. So they're generally you will hear a lot of music, and also music that we play, that kind of has a sound interest. So it's music that's mostly focusing on different timbres, not necessarily a narrative, not necessarily a melody or harmony in the traditional sense, but rather it's using sounds, like the tapping on the back of a bass, or
like lots of like bowing something other than the string, experimenting with like super high harmonics and ponticello stuff.
Yeah, and you know, different kind of mouth sounds, breathing sounds, anything like that. And so those will be the kind of meat that carries the piece. And I think also related to kind of also in the sound world would be pieces that really, really use and are interested in silence, which, thank you, John Cage, there is no such thing as, but you know, essentially pieces that use silence for me, I think we generally think they're not so much about lack of sound as they are about listening in a different way. So it's more an invitation to the audience to say, like, this is our listening time. You know, we're going to listen to whatever.
And then, so that's like Nina said, that's like one element of one kind of music you can get. But then there's so many people writing in such different styles. And like, we certainly try to bring all of that together when we do concerts. So you get also pieces that might borrow really heavily from someone's like folk traditions. So you'll have stuff inspired by folk song, and it's more in sort of specific to us, it's like more sung, like the bass sort of acts as a second voice, and it's very, very vocal music, and it might be tonal or quasi-tonal. There's plenty of composers who are still very interested in using recognizable harmonies and using that. And so it's like you sort of get your pick. Whatever you like about music, you can find a piece being written in that style. And then we have pieces that are very much text-driven. And like you'll find this in any sort of like vocal stuff you see in contemporary operas. You see a range of pieces that are very plot and text driven, where it's like the words are very important and the story is very important. And then you see other ones where it's more about more going into this sound world, sort of interest in sound, where it's non-narrative texts, words get pulled apart, and it's just this like more just thinking about how do you respond to these sounds and these like fragments of words. And so it's like, I think just trying to like condense the whole contemporary music scene into one simple type of music or simple like sentences is not something we can do, because it's now with so many people with so many different backgrounds and so many different lifestyles and so many different
musical practices.
Yeah.
Right?
Now that like, as you know, the globe seems to be shrinking, you get people writing music that have such different stories. And so they're all bringing something very, very different to that. And so as opposed to like going back into our like canon of Western classical music, where all the music we're playing is in a relatively small geographic region, people were being taught the same rules, people were being like learned to listen to the same kinds of things. That music, if you look at a particular year, like of like classical music, like if you're looking in like the late 1700s, all that music is going to be like sort of this classical style, and it's all going to sound like, of course, we can listen and say Haydn and Mozart sound very different from each other because they have different interests, but stylistically it's very similar. But now we have so many different people of so many different backgrounds that it's just so fascinating to bring that all together and to say like, hey, let's take this piece that plays with silence and sound and put it next to this piece that really tells a story and uses like traditional playing and singing, and then put that next to a piece that's really about theatricality, and then see what it does to enhance each piece, because then you suddenly can see things, elements of the other pieces that are tied to each other.
So for us, I mean, in a way, that's our, at least when we play concerts, and those are all, you know, because we always try to think, what is a concert that we would want to go to? And we kind of agree that we like to go to concerts where there are lots of different kinds of music being presented. Like, it's really not fun. Like, both of us like music, but even I don't want to go to a concert that's only pieces that are all about silence, because by the end of it, it's like, wow, I just want to listen to like music, you know? Mm-hmm. And, you know, similarly, like, I don't want to go to, sometimes it's hard to go to a vocal recital that's all pieces of like different poets, and they're all kind of, and I get a little bit like my head gets too clogged with words, you know, by the end. It's like, oh, there were almost too many storylines for me to follow in that. And so for both of us, I always think of it as the tapas concert. Like, we want to, I mean, where you have different pieces, and we want the pieces to be different from each other, because we want their differences to show how amazing what an amazing universe each of those pieces is by itself. And so
one of the things, but one of the other things I think about the contemporary music world, and I know we have tried to talk about this in some of the assemblies and like presentations we've done when we've visited schools, is to show that the contemporary music world is really not that far from what we do in like traditional classical stuff. It's really, both of us are very much classically trained. Both of us really like have a thorough knowledge of that repertoire and have spent a lot of time trying to do that well, and still do it. Like, we still perform stuff that isn't so new. But for me, I think a lot of it is just trying to show that the tools we use to play this new, like, weird stuff is still exactly the same. We think about it the same way. Like, you know, you have to still play in time. You have to think about what kind of sound you want. What kind of vibrato am I going to use here? How am I going to listen to what's going on around me and really blend
or not blend?
Like, am I supposed to be really creating something together, or are we supposed to be like diverging and having separate sounds? And like the same way, like, when I played Brahms, it's like, okay, I know what Brahms is supposed to sound like because people have all, you know, we've passed that down. You want this like this heaviness and like this warm richness in the vibrato. But it's like, okay, if it's a newer composer that doesn't have this tradition, how do I find that sound? Okay, I'll start by looking at the text. What story is it telling me? Mm-hmm. How do I make something sound like this story? How does Nina sound when she sings this passage? What am I going to do? How can I calibrate my vibrato? How can I figure out like my bow placement and speed to figure out how to match that sound? It's all the same tools, just sort of rearranged a little bit differently.
And I think ultimately, I mean, as weird as new music can get, like, music doesn't come from nothing, you know? Like, both of us have played our fair share of like new music being written all over the place. And, you know, you're never given a piece of paper and like, wow, I have no idea what this is. How does it work? It's like, no, we're still using sound, and that sound is moving through time, and you know, and everything is still fundamentally tied to those things that we use. And so, you know, nothing is ever as, you know, totally unfamiliar and unworkable as, you know, sometimes people think it is.
Yeah.
Like when you say new music, like, but like, what it's going to sound like, it's like, oh my God. It's like, it's going to sound, it's still going to sound like music. It might not sound like something, but it will be like things moving in time.
And I think that's an important way to think about it. Like, it's either a continuation of a tradition that we're part of and have been part of for 100 years. It's either a continuation of that, or it's a reaction to it.
Yeah.
So it might be using the same techniques, or it's trying to actively go against them, in which case you need to understand what that tradition is so you know what the relationship to it will be.
Interesting. You've commissioned, how many pieces have you commissioned now? Roughly, we don't need an exact number, but at this point?
Over a dozen at this point.
Something
sort
like
of
that.
in the, over a dozen.
Okay, good.
I don't think
I know, we have an exact number.
Yeah. Okay. So rather, and you've got this great 30 by 30 project, 30 hours of commissioned music by 2030, which I love that goal. And I have a good friend named Garrett Hope who does a composer podcast called The Portfolio Composer. Great guy, lives in Omaha, and we've chatted, and he's chatted, and I think, and since you've done your fair amount of commissioning, you're going to do a lot more. Maybe either advice for performers wanting to commission a piece, or advice to composers going to write for soprano and bass, or both. Any thoughts?
Wait, my first piece of advice is like, yes, do it. Like, don't hold back. Like, if you are a performer and you're like, wow, I just heard this amazing piece of music by someone who's still alive, and I just think that, you know, I would love to be in musical conversation with that person, or like with my friend. Do it. Like, absolutely make music together in whatever way you want to do it.
Also, we have to just give our brief shout out to Omaha, where we played a couple summers ago at Omaha Under the Radar, which is a
Omaha Under the Radar!
really, really fantastic experimental performance festival.
Amazing. Go there.
Run by Amanda DeBoer Bartlett, who is a superhero.
Yes, and her team. Like, it's just fabulous festival. If anyone is in that area and you have the chance to go, do it. It's mind-blowing.
But one of the other things about performers wanting to commission pieces is, like Nina said, if you hear something you like, if you have a composer who you like the way they think about music, talk to them. Ask if they'd be interested in writing. Sometimes, just even if it's someone you're like, oh my God, but they're famous, and I don't know, you know, write to them. They have an email address. You can find them.
We can all find each other on the internet.
And know what it is you're hoping to get. Like, you don't sort of just say like, hey, write something for me. And then you wait until someone gives you a piece and you're like, oh, okay. But like, meet with the composer to be like, okay, here's how I play my instrument. This is what works. These are some sounds. And then the composer will ask, okay, have you thought about trying this technique? Or I'm thinking of a sound somewhat like, you know, when a bass clarinet does that one thing, can you do anything like that? And so, you know, you sit and you look at things together, and then a composer will be like, wow, I really like what you just did there. How would I write that? And so then you spend a little bit of time being like, okay, well, I'm doing this. Maybe, you know, think about notating it this way. Or you can be like, oh, I used that technique in a piece by Lachenmann. This is how he notated it. Because one of my pet peeves is when people try to reinvent ways to notate things that have already been successfully notated. There's no virtue in that. If we have a way to notate it well, stick with it.
Although, okay, I'm a little bit more forgiving in this realm. I think that there are, you know, like notation can be a little bit of a, there's no need to, if you would like to reinvent, let it be a well-researched reinvention. And
know that there is a reason for reinventing it.
Yes. No, have a good reason.
Don't just assume that no one's ever done it.
Exactly. We know how, you know, we've used quarter tones before. There's
ways to write quarter tones.
There are nice ways to write quarter tones that everyone knows.
But so like the thing I think is really important is first just have conversations with composers. Yeah. Have a conversation. Talk to them about what their interests are.
And I think performers, like, you should feel okay to tell, you know, the composer that you want to work with, hey, this is what I love about your music, and this is why I think you would write super well for the group that I have in mind. It's like Eddie and I, we have a wish list of composers that we want to commission. And sometimes we talk about, we're like, oh, I just heard a piece by so-and-so, but, you know, all of the music that I really love by this person is written for large ensemble. And, you know, clearly that composer's sound is rooted in that large ensemble piece. And we're like, well, you know, to be honest, I listened to some of the duo stuff, and that sound rule just didn't translate well. So even though we love that composer's music, it might not work for soprano double bass. But for people who, like, you know, we know, you know, we've heard something, we're like, yes, we definitely want to work with them. Like, in a first meeting, we'll sit down and say, wow, we love your music for these reasons, and we want a piece that has those amazing things in it.
And know, like, when there's a composer you're interested in working with, you know, listen to their music so you know which of their pieces. Because also, like performers, composers have, like, they develop and their style will change. And so know which of their pieces are ones that really resonate with you and speak to you, and be like, these elements of it. So you can tell a composer, these pieces of yours were ones I really liked. And then I think it's also really important for performers to feel like they also have a sense of ownership and collaboration in the commissioning process. So when someone writes something, you're like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to do that. Or like, this is extremely, for Nina, like, this is extremely uncomfortable for me to sing this way.
Yeah.
Say it.
Yeah.
The piece is being written for you.
It should feel good to play.
You should enjoy playing it.
Yeah.
So like, you say, hey, I don't know that I can successfully do that, or I really don't like this. It just makes, like, I feel very uncomfortable playing that. I don't think that I will do it well.
Yeah.
The composer also wants their piece to be performed well. So they're usually going to be agreeable about, like, oh, okay, you know, let's find a good solution where the composer can still get what they want, but the performers feel comfortable.
Yeah. And I think, speaking on the other side, I have basically the same advice for all composers. I mean, for us, we just have an open kind of our emails on our website. If you like what we do, if you're into soprano double bass, if that's like a cool sounding thing, write us an email. So composers, if you go to a concert and you see or hear something by an ensemble, or you just think like, wow, those people played with such incredible energy, or I just love, you know, watching how they perform, reach out. You know, it's totally okay to send an email being like, hey, I'm sorry, like, maybe we don't know each other in person, but like, we could do a great thing musically together. That, you know, we're musicians. We are all musicians, and we like to work with each other. It's a cool thing that we get to do.
And it won't always lead somewhere. Not every time you approach someone will they be like, oh yeah, absolutely. But at least, you know, you have to put yourself out there. You try to do it. Because if you just sit there waiting for someone to come along and write for you or ask you to write for them, it's not necessarily going to happen. You have to just, you know, be willing to, like, just send out emails.
But I think definitely in terms of, you know, in new music, collaboration is a pretty hot word right now. And I think there's some, I think that for anyone who's interested, both performers and composers interested in collaborating, I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, all of it just takes time. Like, really meaningful collaborations, just like really meaningful relationships in music and not in music, they take time, and they're better when they take time. So anyone going into that world, do it absolutely, and give it the time that it needs so that it can be its most awesome thing.
Yeah. And like one, I guess, sort of like final thing that's like been really exciting for us in this project, because you mentioned the 30 by 30, which like is our long-term commissioning project to have there be 30 hours of soprano bass music by 2030. And so of course one part of that is commissioning, but the other part is researching it and compiling that database, which is on our website, so we can track down everything that's ever been written for soprano and bass, because we want other people to play it. And the really exciting thing for us is that that actually is starting to happen. Yeah. That there's now other people playing pieces that we commissioned, other people starting to commission works of their own because they liked pieces that we sort of brought to life. And so it's super, super exciting to watch that happening and like have more people joining this like world of soprano bass, because
it's a thing.
It's a good one. It's a good one. And it's like, it's so easy because just two people, it's so easy to show that range and diversity of kinds of new music, because it's like there's this clarity when there's only the two instruments.
Yeah.
And it's been super, super fun for us to like watch that happen and hopefully see more of that.
Nina, Eddie, you two rock. Love what you're doing. Keep it up. Can't wait to follow along and see these 30 hours of music materialize in the future. What a cool project. And I hope wherever you're listening that you had a good time following along with this episode and with Nina and Eddie. Be sure to follow them on Instagram, follow them everywhere you hang out online. And I have such a great time chatting with these people each and every week. It's such a fun project, this podcast. I can't believe it's been going on since 2007. That makes me feel very old. But I have a great time. Maybe this is your first episode. Maybe it's your 617th episode. Regardless, thank you so much for listening. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. There are a ton of ways to do it. Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and we have an app and blah, 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 blah. Contrabassconversations.com is the website. You can find out all sorts of information there. And I'm going to give a shout out here as we approach the fall to our other site, our main site, I guess, doublebassblog.org. We've been hard at work all summer redesigning a lot of new and exciting changes coming there. So if you haven't checked that out recently, go ahead and check it out. Contrabassconversations.com, doublebassblog.org. Folks, if you're starting a project, don't create multiple websites like I did. It was 2005 and I had no idea what I was doing. But regardless, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, share with a friend, like it on social media. That helps spread the word more than anything. And we have a lot of people listening to this show each and every week, but it's still a minority of the bass world and the music world in general. There are so many people that I know would love to learn about Eddie and Nina and what they're up to. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Stephen Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring, award-winning luthier Mitch Mooring, let me tell you. He won a silver medal for tone at the 2019 ISB convention. He's making beautiful basses, and he's got a new shop opening up in Kilgore, Texas, not too far from Dallas. Learn more about him at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper for cataloging and archiving and helping us enact future plans with all of this material. And we do have future plans, folks. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.